Last week, the United States signed a nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia. The next day, President Trump posted that there would be no enrichment and that the whole thing depends on Riyadh recognizing Israel. So, which is it?
Saudi Arabia, and if they didn't join the Abraham Accords, the deal's not, I'm not going to do the deal.
If you have something on your soil, you can always tell the Americans to leave. And there you go, you have it. But there's another reason why you have to worry. So you're running several risks here by saying, well, you can enrich eventually, or we'll do it on your soil under certain safeguards. It's not a complete thought if you're really eager to keep the country in question from getting a bomb. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, they've been pretty clear that if they think Iran's getting a bomb, they have to get one too.
Hi, Henry, again.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. So, Henry,
Okay.
last week, the United States signed a nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia. The next day, President Trump posted that there would be no enrichment and that the whole thing depends on Riyadh recognizing Israel. So, which is it? And what did Washington actually sign? Henry Sookolsky runs the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center. He was the Pentagon Deputy for Non-Proliferation Policy, and he has spent decades on one question: what actually counts as peaceful nuclear energy? Welcome back again, Henry. Since we last spoke together, I want to start, if I was in Cairo or in Amman, and I have never heard of the phrase 1-2-3 agreement in my life, what do I need to understand about it and why it matters?
1-2-3 agreements refer to Section 123 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act, which provides for extending civil nuclear cooperation, in particular, the export of otherwise controlled and prohibited for export items that are, quote unquote, especially sensitive from a nuclear explosive standpoint to other countries. And they have conditions. A standard agreement, which likely is part of this deal, but not the entire explanation of it, provides for the export of items on that list, the control list, to Saudi Arabia if it wishes, as long as it gives us notice of breaking out and trying to retransfer any of that technology or goods to someone else, and or chooses to violate their obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which says you will not acquire a nuclear weapon.
In 2009, the American told the UAE, no enrichment on your soil, no reprocessing, signed the extra inspections protocol, and it was called the gold standard. I would love to know more about the gold standard from you. What does it mean? And what's the difference between UAE and Saudi Arabia? Because Saudi Arabia doesn't have all these restrictions. And why? Is it the country? Is it the politics? Is it the moment?
Excellent question. Let's clarify what was agreed to in 2009 with the United Arab Emirates. At that time, the United States understood that if you make nuclear fuel, which involves moving liquids, gases, and powders, things that are extremely difficult to keep account of, you're pretty much in the business of not getting warning if you inspect of a diversion for military purposes. And so the best protection is not to get into that business at all. At the time it was first negotiated, there were words said, well, we probably won't get into those activities. That was not considered good enough. The deal was tightened twice until there was a requirement that in law, public law, the United Arab Emirates forswore making nuclear fuel. In addition, it required them to adopt the additional protocol. Now, what is that? It's an inspection authority that you allow the IAEA to exercise that gives them the right to come to your country and inspect not only where you have a declared nuclear activity in sight, but where you don't. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, the forswearing did not occur at all. Worse, they did not agree to the additional protocol, which raises the question, do they have something to hide or do they think they will? 144 countries, almost all the countries in the world, have agreed to the additional protocol, not Saudi Arabia. Not only that, but there are two side letters in addition to the 123 that are being reported upon. We haven't seen them. Of course, we haven't even seen 123 agreement yet. But there have been a lot of reporting based on briefings that the Energy Department has given reporters that indicate that the way this agreement will work is first, after 90 consecutive legislative days of sitting before Congress, which could be sometime before the end of this year, it will come into force. And then there'll be a 2-year study on, well, is the making of nuclear fuel by enriching uranium really all that economical for Saudi Arabia? However, if the conclusion of that is yes, then the United States would actually build a plant, an enrichment plant, that would bring, the most sensitive technologies that we're now currently bombing in Iran to Saudi Arabian soil. And it would be under American supervision. And the hope is that somehow that would be enough to keep it from ever being diverted. And then if we decided no, the agreement somehow will bind the Saudis to not get enrichment from anyone else for 10 years. Also, there's a side agreement that under this deal, they can only buy reactors from Westinghouse, which is a firm that has a headquarters in Pennsylvania, but is entirely owned, I might add, by 2 Canadian firms. All the profits go to Canada. So those are that's what we know from reporting. And more about this deal might emerge once they send it up to the Hill.
When we're preparing for this conversation, me and you mentioned a lot of interesting stuff. One of the things that I stopped myself on and I said, I want to ask you more about it. You were saying once you have enrichment inside the country and doing it inside the country, that means you can do nuclear weapons. It's different than...
Well, it makes it a lot easier. Let's say somehow there is a way to prevent anyone from diverting whatever plant might be built that is declared from making nuclear weapons. Now, I am extremely skeptical of that proposition, if only because we have this expression in the United States, possession is 90% of the law. If you have something on your soil, you can always tell the Americans to leave. And there you go, you have it. Now you can say, oh, well, they won't know how to operate it. Well, we've seen all sorts of things like that of other countries, and lo and behold, they're a lot smarter than we think. But there's another reason why you have to worry. As I noted already with the additional protocol, there will not be an additional protocol being applied to Saudi Arabia under this deal, which means they're not subject to anytime, anywhere inspections, which means they could have a covert program and keep it covert much more easily without the additional protocol. And it isn't as though they don't know countries that know how to enrich. One of them is Pakistan. And, they could import and do things under the wire. Now you say, oh, well, America knows everything about Saudi Arabia. Well, if you take a look at the track record with regard to missile activities, the Saudis are pretty good about keeping things even from the Americans when it comes to things they don't want the Americans to know about. And the track record there is 100% consistent. Every time they've gotten a missile, it was too late for us to do anything to block it. So I don't know why this would be any different. So you're running several risks here by saying, well, you can enrich eventually, or will do it on your soil under certain safeguards. It's not a complete thought if you're really eager to keep the country in question from getting a bomb. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, they've been pretty clear that if they think Iran's getting a bomb, they have to get one too.
Of course, and this is what Mohammed bin Salman said on many occasions as well. This leads me to another question. So what do you call what was signed on Wednesday, July 22nd, between the U.S. Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, and Saudi Energy Minister Abdulaziz bin Salman? They signed a 1-2-3 agreement. And then the second day, Trump did post on it. It's going to be a yes if they recognize Israel. That means the Abraham Accord. Is it a statement? Is it a text? And what is the next step? What's going to happen in the Congress? What do you read into all this?
Well, I'm with the Saudis on this. I think they've got it right, which is, you got to be kidding. We signed documents. They didn't have anything in it about these other conditions. It is not part of the deal. And it isn't. Now, if he sends this thing up to the Hill, which odds are he's gonna, 90 days goes by, it comes into force. Now, I suppose the president would have the prerogative of saying, well, it may be enforced, but I'm not going to approve any exports to Saudi Arabia. He has that power, but it's not something that he's legally bound to do. It's something that's executive discretion. So that's roughly what you've got going on here. And it hasn't sat well with a lot of people on the Hill, including some people who are staunch supporters of Mr. Trump, including a Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, who was quite emphatic, saying there's no way he's going to support this. Now, you don't need many Republican senators to join a whole lot of Democrats to pass a piece of legislation. If the House goes Democratic, which a lot of experts think will happen, it's quite possible that there'd be legislation. Could the president veto it later? You bet. Would it be extremely embarrassing for this to happen? Yeah, it would. You do not, as a president, want to see that coming to your desk, even if you veto it. So the game may be on just as soon as we find out it's hit the Hill, at least this package.
Not only Saudi Arabia, not only UAE, not only other countries like you have now Turkey and other countries. Everybody wants to do enrichment. Everybody wants to have it. Why should we ask Saudi Arabia or anybody else to sign the treaty? Is it mandatory?
Well, the treaty actually has been signed by all of the countries you mentioned. What's interesting is, with the exception of the UAE, Erdogan, his foreign minister, the Egyptians, in fairness, I don't think they've gone public, but certainly the Turks have. And the Saudis, I just explained how, they say, well, we may have to get a nuclear weapon. And certainly what I said, which was quoted a little bit, was, whither Saudi Arabia, so goes the Middle East. I mean, you have Iran, who is enriching uranium, or was, and wants to probably again, us saying, well, eventually in 5, 10, or 20 years, we could countenance you resuming, which more or less concedes, well, apparently you have a right, conditional right at least, to make nuclear fuel. We're saying this in so many words to Saudi Arabia because we're saying, even if you disagree with our determination in Sun Economic, you can proceed after 10 years. Why wouldn't that be the model for Egypt, Turkey, and the UAE? Now, in the case of the UAE, I think it's been mentioned before by lots of people. If you read the agreement that was struck in 2009, it includes a provision that says if a neighbor gets more generous terms from the United States for what they can do
they can open
is
it.
In this agreement, you can renegotiate,
yes.
or you have grounds for asking for renegotiation. I think they would exercise that because we know back in 2018, I believe, they approached Ed Royce, who was chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, telling him that why shouldn't they demand that, given that we were recognizing indirectly that Iran could enrich uranium under the agreement that we had struck under President Obama. Now, we got them to back off on that, or they changed their mind, take your pick. But in this case, it really is a 1, 2, 3 agreement. I mean, I think before we said, well, whatever we agreed with the Iranians wasn't a 1, 2, 3 agreement, so it doesn't trigger that provision. But in this case, it might very well trigger that. So you have to think that there's an even chance the UAE will squawk about this. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Iran, seems to be angling for them. Saudi Arabia seems to be angling for them. The UAE might want to have the right to angle for them. Well, certainly Egypt and Turkey, which have these large nuclear plants, and were asked to forego making nuclear fuel and refused.
And they refused, yes, they refused.
They refused. Tells you that, how this story ends isn't exactly clear, but it doesn't sound like a story in which everyone's lying down with the lamb or the lion, but rather sharpening their claws for possible conflict.
So technically what you're saying, if I was in Turkey, if I was in Egypt, if I was even UAE, how would I read into the Saudi Arabia deal with the US? How would I perceive that?
Well, I can't speak for them, but, folks assume the worst when someone says they're going to do something and they have the means to do it. So, this is not rocket surgery, as they would say in the U.S. It's not complex. Now, there's another dimension of this that's worrisome. The proponents of doing nuclear cooperation with Saudi Arabia love to say, well, if we don't do it, someone else will do it. Now, this is a self-fulfilling fallacy. What do I mean? Well, since the Indian test explosion a half century ago, the United States stopped helping countries make nuclear fuel. And lo and behold, all of the other countries, even Russia and China, publicly at least went on record saying they wouldn't do it either. You can undo that with this agreement if it has a subsequent arrangement to allow nuclear fuel making. That cannot be good. And I think what then you are doing is making the very problem that you claim you're solving by getting into the slave trade to control it, as the British would say, by getting into it. In other words, people say, well, if you're going to do that, then we got to do that. So this is going to be something I think you're going to hear a lot about. I think you're already seeing it in a lot of editorials. People get that point. I think more people need to get it.
Henry, you've been doing this for decades, and you've been in the Pentagon, and you've been speaking about that for years. If I asked you simply, what would be the map 15 years from now? Because you saw the map 20 years before. So what would be your projection? How would you see the map of nuclear 15 years from now?
I think it depends on what we do here. I mean, let's be blunt. There's a reason why people who care about this issue, like myself, might expend 10 years, yelling and screaming in the parking lot with tinfoil on their hat and a shopping cart, because now I think it's on us. And you'll notice the chattering class is making a lot of noise on the right and the left. Good. I think the noise is warranted. I think what we now need to do is make it clear that this is not a good idea to allow fuel making, at the very least, and that the executive rethink what they're doing, maybe not submit the agreement, or maybe make it darn sure that they're not going to improve enrichment, and that the side letter maybe be conditioned by some legislation that says we will not, in fact, spend or allow you to reprogram any money to implement this deal unless it's clear that there will be no nuclear fuel making under it, and that we make a correction to that. Now, we have not yet actually committed to making nuclear fuel for them. We said there's going to be a 2-year study. I think this allowance, if it's true that, oh, well, you can do anything you want in 10 years, I think we need to say, we're not going to be a party to that. You know, and you will be isolated if you go down that path. I think that the policies that the world, not just the United States, has adopted in avoiding helping anyone make nuclear fuel that doesn't have nuclear weapons is a policy we can live with. The other, I just don't know how the story ends, and it could end very badly.
The agreement that it was done between the US and Saudi Arabia about the nuclear enrichment, do you see it seeing the light? What is your opinion on that?
Well, I'd like to think it was a trial balloon with not a whole lot of sound judgment going into how to do that. And I think the people who crafted this may have been a little too clever by half, not knowing exactly what they were locking into. So I can't judge this. I don't know. And I think one of the great reasons people watch the United States is a lot of things can happen because, at least in theory, we have 3 branches of government. And we have to wait and see whether the executive reconsiders what it's doing and whether the legislative branch chooses to clear its throat on this point. They haven't even gotten to the middle of the stage, and the stage lights haven't turned on. They will pretty soon, though.
Henry, thank you very much for your time and for this enlightening conversation.
All right. Thank you.